London, 1967. The body of a high-ranking British diplomat is found on the cold pavement beneath his apartment window. In his pocket, police find a suicide note containing only 2 words: "Forgive me." The Russian spy who destroyed him reads it 3 times, then walks into the enemy embassy to confess everything. I'm Victor Red. Today's case: Elena Volkova, the KGB's deadliest swallow. She weaponized love to destroy British intelligence, then did the unthinkable. Was it revenge or redemption? Let's find out. On a November evening in 1958, inside a luxurious suite at Moscow's Metropole Hotel, something occurred that would alter the fate of 2 nations. 32-year-old British Embassy attaché Maurice Clark lay motionless on the bed, unable to move. His body was paralyzed not by poison, but by terror. Beside him slept 23-year-old Russian beauty Elena, whom he had met 3 months earlier at the Bolshoi Theater. Someone was knocking insistently at the door. Clark knew that behind that door, the police were not waiting for him. He was expected by people who had already possessed compromising photographs for 2 weeks. Photographs taken in this very room. Photographs in which he betrayed not only his wife, but his queen. Elena opened one eye and smiled coldly. Maurice understood that the person he had fallen in love with had never existed. The knocking grew louder, more demanding, like the hammering of his own panicked heart against his ribs. He wanted desperately to believe this was merely a nightmare, that he would wake in his modest London flat, and that Margaret would be brewing morning tea in the kitchen, and that his greatest concern would be choosing which tie to wear to the Foreign Office. But the bitter Moscow cold seeping through the slightly open window reminded him exactly where he was and what he had done. Elena rose from the bed with liquid grace, wrapped herself in a silk robe the color of fresh blood, and moved toward the door without so much as a glance in his direction. In that terrible moment, Maurice noticed something he had somehow missed during their 3 months together. Her movements were too precise, too economical, and utterly devoid of the natural hesitations and imperfections that make a person human rather than mechanical. How had he been so blind? How had he failed to see that every touch, every whispered endearment, every passionate gasp had been rehearsed and perfected like lines in a play? The door swung open, and 3 men in gray suits entered with the quiet efficiency of pallbearers. In a sense, well, that was exactly what they were. They had come to bury Maurice Clark's former life and whatever remained of his honor. The tallest among them, a man with a face like carved stone and eyes empty of anything resembling mercy, placed a thick manila folder on the small table near the window. He did not need to open it. Maurice knew precisely what those pages contained. 23 photographs documenting his descent into betrayal with clinical precision. Him and Elena in positions that would send his aristocratic wife into hysterics. Him and Elena in moments of intimacy that no gentleman should ever allow to be captured on film. Each photograph was another nail hammered into the coffin of everything he had worked to build over 15 years of diplomatic service. The stone-faced man spoke in flawless, accentless English that somehow made the entire situation more menacing than if he had bellowed threats in Russian. His words were simple, almost conversational, as though he were discussing cricket scores rather than the systematic destruction of a man's entire existence. The choice was brutally clear: cooperation or exposure. Service to the Soviet Union or immediate professional annihilation. Become an asset or become a cautionary tale. There was no third option, no room for negotiation, no clever diplomatic maneuvering that could extract him from this trap. This was the inescapable reality of the game Maurice had unwittingly entered the moment he accepted Elena's invitation for coffee after that fateful performance of Swan Lake. Maurice looked desperately at Elena, searching her face for something, anything, some flicker of the warmth he had known, some trace of genuine feeling beneath the mask. She met his gaze with eyes as cold and depthless as a frozen lake. Whatever she had been during their autumn romance, whoever had laughed at his awkward jokes and listened patiently to his complaints about London weather, had vanished as completely as smoke. The woman standing before him now was a stranger, a consummate professional, a weapon forged and sharpened in the secret training facilities of Soviet intelligence. She had performed her role with flawless precision, and now the final curtain had fallen to reveal the stage machinery. The tall man was still waiting for an answer, though everyone in that room already knew what it would be. Men like Maurice Clark always broke eventually. That was precisely why they were selected as targets in the first place. The story had begun much earlier, 4 years before that November night. In a secret building on the outskirts of Moscow, 30 young women underwent training that the West would have considered impossible. The School for Swallows, as they were known in the narrow circles of the KGB, transformed ordinary Soviet girls into the perfect weapon of the Cold War. Elena Volkova was one of the most talented students. She spoke 4 languages fluently, understood the psychology of men better than professional psychiatrists, and could transform herself so completely that even her handlers sometimes forgot who she really was. Her true biography was simple and tragic. The daughter of a repressed professor, raised in an orphanage, she dreamed of only one thing: to prove herself worthy of bearing her father's name. The KGB offered her a chance to serve the motherland. That this service would require sacrificing her own body and soul was not explained to her immediately. By the time they explained it, retreat was impossible. Elena already knew too much. The facility where she trained existed on no official maps. It stood behind high walls topped with barbed wire, guarded by men who never smiled and never spoke about what happened inside. The 30 girls who entered those gates in the spring of 1954 were all carefully selected. Orphans mostly, or daughters of enemies of the state who needed to prove their loyalty. Girls who were beautiful but not vain, intelligent but not questioning, desperate enough to accept any opportunity for redemption. The training lasted 18 months and broke more than half of them. Some girls simply disappeared one night, and the remaining students learned quickly not to ask questions. The curriculum was unlike anything taught in any other institution in the world. Languages and dialects until they could pass as natives of London, Paris, or New York. The arts of seduction broken down into scientific principles like physics or chemistry. How to read a man's vulnerabilities in the tightness around his eyes, the way he held his glass, the topics he avoided in conversation. How to become whatever fantasy he harbored in the secret chambers of his heart. How to make him believe that fate itself had brought them together. They studied the cultures of target nations with the intensity of scholars preparing for doctoral examinations. British social hierarchy and the unspoken rules of class. American optimism and its peculiar blend of puritanism and excess. French sophistication and the art of intellectual seduction. German precision and the lingering trauma of war. Every detail mattered, because a single mistake could mean exposure, imprisonment, or death. I'm Victor Red, If you want a dedicated video on the most brutal Special Forces training ever devised, make sure to subscribe to the Red Files. We're declassifying that story as we speak. Elena excelled at all of it. She had a gift for languages that her instructors called supernatural. She could adopt accents so perfectly that native speakers swore she had grown up in their hometowns. But her real talent was something deeper and more disturbing. She could make herself believe the lies she told. When she played the role of a lonely translator yearning for adventure, she felt that loneliness in her bones. When she became a passionate artist seeking inspiration, she genuinely saw the world through an artist's eyes. This ability to disappear into her roles made her invaluable, but it also meant that each operation stripped away another layer of whoever Elena Volkova had been before entering those gates. The physical training was just as demanding as the psychological preparation. They learned to plant listening devices in hotel rooms in under 2 minutes. How to photograph documents with cameras concealed in jewelry or cigarette cases. How to slip sedatives into drinks without being detected. How to defend themselves if an operation went wrong, though they were taught that killing should always be the last resort because a dead target revealed nothing. The instructors never used that particular label, though that was what some of the girls whispered among themselves in the dormitory at night. The official term was intelligence operative, specializing in human asset development. The reality was something darker and more complex than either phrase captured. They were being trained to weaponize intimacy itself, to turn the fundamental human need for connection into a tool of espionage. By the time Elena graduated at the top of her class in the autumn of 1955, she had become someone her father would not have recognized. She wondered sometimes if that was a form of mercy. Maurice Clark was the perfect target, though he had no idea. Married to the daughter of an influential lord, he worked in the military intelligence section of the British Embassy and had access to information about NATO nuclear weapon deployment throughout Europe. His weakness was simple: an unhappy marriage and a passionate nature he had spent his entire life suppressing for the sake of career and propriety. When in September of 1958, at the Bolshoi Theater during intermission, a stunningly beautiful woman who had dropped her program appeared beside him, he never noticed how carefully everything had been planned. A casual conversation about music, her embarrassed smile, an invitation for coffee next time. Within 3 months, Maurice had fallen in love in a way he never had before. Elena was everything missing from his life: passionate, intelligent, understanding. She listened to him for hours, admired his work, showed interest in his opinions about international politics. He never noticed how subtly she steered conversations in the right direction, how she remembered every word, every detail. The selection of Maurice Clark as a target had taken 6 months of meticulous preparation. KGB analysts had reviewed the files of every British Embassy employee, searching for the perfect combination of access and vulnerability. Clark's name rose to the top of the list for reasons that would have horrified him had he known. His marriage to Margaret Ashford had been strategic rather than romantic, a union that pleased both families but left both parties quietly miserable. Margaret spent most of her time in London, claiming the Moscow climate aggravated her health, while Maurice buried himself in work and the occasional diplomatic reception. He was lonely in the specific way that made men dangerous to themselves, the kind of loneliness that no amount of professional success could fill. The KGB psychologists who studied his profile noted his love of classical music, his habit of attending performances alone, his tendency to linger during intermissions, as though hoping something unexpected might happen. They noted the way he looked at attractive women with a mixture of longing and guilt, the way he drank slightly too much at parties when Margaret was not present, the way his carefully maintained facade of British reserve showed hairline cracks when he thought no one was watching. Elena had prepared for Maurice Clark the way a surgeon prepares for a delicate operation. She spent 2 weeks attending every performance at the Bolshoi, learning his patterns, his preferences, the subtle body language that revealed his emotional state. She read everything he had ever published, every speech he had given, every interview he had granted to diplomatic journals. She studied Margaret's background until she knew exactly what kind of wife Maurice had, and therefore exactly what kind of woman he secretly craved. The encounter during the intermission of Swan Lake had been rehearsed, but appeared entirely spontaneous. Elena had positioned herself precisely where Maurice would see her drop the program, had timed the stumble so he would instinctively reach to help, had calibrated her smile to be grateful but not flirtatious, appreciative but not available. Their conversation about Tchaikovsky lasted exactly 7 minutes, long enough to establish connection, but short enough to leave him wanting more. She mentioned casually that she worked as a translator at the Ministry of Culture, a lie supported by layers of documentation that would survive any background check Maurice might discreetly run. Their second meeting, 3 days later at a café near the Kremlin, was equally calculated, but felt to Maurice like serendipity. Elena expressed surprise at seeing him again, laughed at his jokes with genuine warmth, and listened with rapt attention as he discussed the challenges of diplomatic work in Moscow. She asked intelligent questions that made him feel valued and understood in ways Margaret never had. She touched his hand briefly when making a point, a gesture innocent enough to be deniable but intimate enough to send electricity through his nervous system. Over the following weeks, Elena became the center of Maurice's emotional world. She shared carefully curated details about her supposedly difficult childhood that made him want to protect her. She confessed fears and dreams that mirrored his own. She made him feel like the man he had always imagined himself to be, rather than the man he had become through compromise and resignation. When they finally became lovers in late October, Maurice believed it was the most spontaneous and genuine thing that had ever happened to him. He had no idea that even his passion had been anticipated, guided, and exploited with clinical precision. On that November evening when Maurice realized he had fallen into a trap, everything happened with terrifying speed. The man in the gray suit placed a folder of photographs before him. 23 images, each one signifying the end of his career, the disgrace of his family, and possibly charges of high treason. The proposition was simple. Either these photographs would reach British counterintelligence, or Maurice would begin cooperating. The information they demanded from him seemed insignificant: the location of certain military installations, names of agents working under diplomatic cover, details of negotiations. Maurice spent the entire night in the hotel room, staring at the ceiling. Elena had disappeared immediately after the KGB men arrived. He never saw her again. By morning he had broken. For the next 3 years, Maurice Clark passed everything they requested to Soviet intelligence. He became one of the KGB's most valuable sources in Europe. The information he provided allowed Moscow to know precisely the location of nuclear weapons in West Germany, Italy, and Turkey. This intelligence shifted the balance of power in the Cold War. The mechanics of his betrayal became routine with sickening speed. Every 2 weeks, Maurice received instructions through a dead drop near Gorky Park, a hollowed-out brick in a crumbling wall where he found coded messages specifying what information was needed next. He photographed documents late at night in his embassy office using a miniature camera the KGB had provided, his hands shaking so badly at first that half the images came out blurred. They sent the camera back with a curt note demanding better quality. He learned. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Maurice could not sleep without medication. He could not eat without his stomach rebelling. He lost 14 pounds in the first 2 months, and his colleagues began asking if he was ill. He told them it was the Moscow winter, the unfamiliar food, the stress of his workload. In truth, he was being hollowed out from the inside, consumed by the knowledge of what he had become. Every morning he looked in the mirror and saw a traitor staring back. He tried to rationalize his actions with the desperate logic of the compromised. The information he provided was not that sensitive, he told himself. The Soviets probably already knew most of it through other sources. He was not really hurting anyone. These lies lasted until May of 1959, when he learned that 2 British agents operating in East Berlin had been arrested and executed. Their names had been on a list he had photographed 3 weeks earlier. Maurice vomited for an hour after reading the classified cable reporting their deaths. He knew their faces from embassy briefings. One of them had a wife and 2 young daughters. The KGB handler who met him the following week showed no sympathy. The man, who called himself Victor, though that was certainly not his real name, listened to Maurice's anguished confession about the dead agents with the emotional engagement of someone hearing a weather report. Victor reminded Maurice that he had made his choice in that hotel room, and that the consequences of that choice would continue whether Maurice had moral qualms or not, and that any attempt to stop cooperating or confess to British authorities would result not only in Maurice's exposure, but in similar fates for people he cared about. They had already compiled detailed files on his sister in Yorkshire and his elderly mother in Bath, and even Margaret, despite their failed marriage. The message was unmistakably clear. Maurice was no longer a person making decisions. He was a resource being exploited, and resources did not get to have opinions about their use. The quality and sensitivity of information demanded from Maurice increased steadily. By 1960, he was providing details about NATO strategic planning, nuclear weapon deployment schedules, and the identities of Western intelligence personnel throughout the Soviet sphere. Each piece of intelligence he betrayed felt like cutting off another piece of his own soul. He fantasized constantly about escape, about confessing everything to his superiors and accepting whatever punishment followed, about simply walking into traffic and ending the nightmare. But the combination of fear and the terrible inertia of ongoing betrayal kept him trapped. It was easier to provide one more document than to face the consequences of 3 years of treason. By 1961, Maurice Clark had become arguably the most damaging penetration of British intelligence since the Cambridge spy ring. Moscow Center regarded him as a triumph of the honey trap methodology, proof that the right combination of psychological manipulation and sexual compromise could turn even supposedly trustworthy diplomats into reliable assets. His case file was used in training new handlers as an example of how to properly exploit a successfully recruited source. After the operation with Clark, Elena received the rank of major and a new assignment. For 9 years, she conducted 16 successful operations across 7 countries. Each time it was a new person, a new legend, a new life. A French general working on advanced air defense systems, an American diplomat with access to NATO plans, a West German industrialist manufacturing missile components. Each time she entered their lives as salvation, as love, as destiny. Each time she destroyed them with the cold efficiency of a surgeon. The pattern never varied. Weeks of preparation, studying their habits, their weaknesses, their hungers. Then the chance encounter, carefully orchestrated to seem like fate, a dropped book in a Paris café, a shared umbrella in a London rainstorm, a conversation at a diplomatic reception in Bonn. She became whoever they needed her to be. For the French general, she was a passionate intellectual who understood the burden of military secrets. For the American diplomat, she was a sophisticated European who made him feel young again. For the German industrialist, she was the artistic soul his pragmatic life had always lacked. They all fell in love with ghosts, with women who existed only in carefully constructed performances. And when the trap closed, when the photographs appeared or the recording devices were revealed, they all wore the same expression Maurice had worn that November night in the Metropole. Betrayal has only one face, no matter what language it speaks. She drank to silence the voices of the people she had betrayed. Vodka at first, then wine, then anything that would make the memories blur. She took sleeping pills to avoid seeing their faces in her dreams, but they came anyway. Maurice most of all. She still remembered his bewildered look that night when he understood the truth, the way his hands had trembled as he held the photographs, the way his voice broke when he asked if any of it had been real. She had walked out without answering, as she had been trained to do. That silence was its own answer. Sometimes she tried to convince herself that it was all necessary, that she was serving a great purpose. The information she extracted, the agents she helped recruit, the operations she enabled, all of it advanced Soviet interests in the global struggle. The men she destroyed were enemies of her country, targets in a war that never ended. But these justifications grew thinner with each passing year. In her apartment in Moscow, surrounded by commendations and medals she could never wear in public, she looked in the mirror and saw not a heroine, but a monster. The face staring back at her was still beautiful. That was the cruelest part. The weapon remained sharp even as the person wielding it corroded from within. In 1967, Elena learned from an intercepted MI6 report that Maurice Clark had killed himself by jumping from the window of his London apartment. They found him with a note containing only 2 words, "Forgive me." She read the report 3 times in the soundproof basement of KGB headquarters, her hands steady, her face expressionless. Only later, alone in her apartment, did she allow herself to feel anything. She sat by the window, the same kind of window Maurice had chosen for his exit, and wondered what those 2 words meant. Was he asking forgiveness from his wife, his country, his God, or from her, for having been foolish enough to believe that love could exist in a world built on lies? She never learned the answer, but she kept a copy of that report hidden in her apartment, returning to it on nights when the sleeping pills failed to work. It was the only honest thing in her life. Proof that her actions had consequences, and that the weapon she had become left corpses in its wake. Maurice Clark was not the first man she had destroyed, but he was the one who refused to stay silent, even in death. In March of 1971, Major Elena Volkova was scheduled to fly to Paris for a new operation. Her target was a French Defense Ministry official with access to NATO's nuclear deployment strategies in Europe. She had already studied his file for 6 weeks, memorizing his routines, his marriage troubles, his fondness for jazz and Russian literature. The legend was prepared, the chance encounter planned down to the minute. But on the morning of her departure, Elena walked past the airport and took a taxi to the British Embassy in Moscow instead. The guards at the gate initially took her for a mad woman. A well-dressed Russian woman demanding to see the MI6 station chief was either insane or KGB provocation. But when she calmly recited 3 code names of active Soviet agents operating in London, names that appeared in no file, that existed only in the most classified briefings, the atmosphere changed instantly. Within minutes, she was escorted through multiple security checkpoints into a windowless room where the station chief himself waited. For 6 hours, she told them everything. The school for swallows and its training methods, the psychological techniques used to break targets, the recruitment strategies, the active operations across Western Europe. She named the agents she had helped recruit, described the compromising materials held on dozens of Western officials, detailed the KGB's infiltration networks in 7 countries. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, her memory a perfect archive of 9 years of operations. The British intelligence officers filled notebook after notebook, occasionally stopping her to verify details, but mostly just listening in stunned silence as she dismantled Soviet intelligence operations piece by piece. She demanded only one thing in return. Maurice Clark's family had to be told the truth, that he had been a victim, not a traitor, that he had been entrapped, manipulated, and destroyed by a system that weaponized human connection. That his suicide was not the act of a guilty man, but of a broken one. The British agreed without hesitation. It was a small price for the intelligence windfall she represented. Within a week, Elena was smuggled out of Moscow in a diplomatic vehicle, hidden beneath false floorboards as the car passed through Soviet checkpoints. She spent 3 days in a safe house in Helsinki before being flown to London on a military transport. The information she provided led to the collapse of 17 Soviet operations and the exposure of 23 agents across Europe and North America. It was one of the most devastating blows to the KGB in the entire Cold War, a hemorrhage of secrets that took Soviet intelligence years to recover from. Elena received a new name and a new life in a small English town whose name appears on no official record. The British government provided her with a modest pension and a cottage with a garden where she grew vegetables and kept to herself. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet widow who spoke with a slight accent and rarely socialized. She learned to live with silence, with the absence of legends and performances. For the first time since she was 18 years old, she was simply herself. Though after so many years of being other people, she was no longer certain who that was. But every year, on the 1st of November, she took the train to London and then a taxi to a cemetery in the northern suburbs. There, at Maurice Clark's grave, she stood for hours, regardless of weather. She never brought flowers. She never spoke aloud. She simply stood, bearing witness to the destruction she had caused, knowing that no betrayal of the KGB could atone for what she had done to this man and to all the others whose lives she had shattered in the name of duty and ideology. A weapon of the Cold War cannot unlearn how to kill. It can only choose which direction to point the barrel. Elena had pointed hers at the heart of the system that transformed love into weaponry and people into targets. But there was no victory in this story. There were only the ruins of human lives and an unanswered question that haunted her until the end. How many more Maurices and Elenas had perished in a war that nobody saw, in battles fought in hotel rooms and cafés rather than on battlefields, where the casualties wore no uniforms and received no medals, where the only monument to their suffering was silence?